On the morning of October 14th, 1944, two German generals arrived at a quiet villa in the village of Herrlingen near Ulm in southwestern Germany. Their car rolled up the driveway with the deliberate purpose of men carrying out a sentence that had already been decided at the highest levels of the Third Reich. Inside the house, a 15-year-old boy named Manfred Rommel sat unaware that his world was about to collapse. His father, one of the most celebrated military commanders in all of German history, was about to be given a choice that was no choice at all. And when it was over, the family of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel would be left to carry the weight of that morning for the rest of their lives. What happened to the wife, the son, and the extended family of the Desert Fox after the war ended? How did they navigate the ruins of a collapsed empire, the shame of association, and the strange burden of bearing one of the most famous names in 20th century military history? In this video we will find out. So without further ado, let's begin. To understand what became of Erwin Rommel's family after World War II, we first need to understand the circumstances under which Rommel himself left the stage of history, because the manner of his death shaped everything that followed for those who loved him. Erwin Johannes Eugen Rommel was born on November 15, 1891, in Heidenheim an der Brenz, a small town in the Kingdom of Württemberg, which was then part of the German Empire. He was the second of four children born to Erwin Rommel Sr., a schoolmaster and later a headmaster, and Helena von Lutz. From the beginning, young Erwin was not an especially distinguished student in the classical academic sense, but he showed an early fascination with engineering and mechanics, building a full-size glider as a teenager with a school friend, an endeavour that hinted at the technical imagination and audacious thinking that would later define his military career. He entered the Württemberg Army in 1910 as an officer cadet, and was commissioned as a lieutenant in 1912. When the First World War broke out in 1914, he proved himself almost immediately to be a fighter of exceptional ability, daring, and tactical instincts. He was awarded the Pour le Mérite, Imperial Germany's highest military decoration, for his actions in Romania and Italy, particularly during the Battle of Caporetto in October 1917, where he led a small force to capture thousands of Italian prisoners with minimal casualties to his own men. It was the kind of audacious, fast-moving warfare that would become his signature. By the time the Second World War began, Rommel was already a respected military figure, a personal favourite of Adolf Hitler, and someone whose ideas about mobile armoured warfare were perfectly matched to the lightning campaigns that the Wehrmacht unleashed on an astonished Europe. His rise to international fame came in 1941 and 1942, when he commanded the Afrika Korps in the North African desert and earned the nickname that would follow him into history, the Desert Fox. His ability to maneuver, to strike from unexpected directions, to push his forces at seemingly impossible speed, won him admiration from his enemies as well as his allies. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill called him a great general, and that kind of recognition from the opposing side cemented Rommel's place in the mythology of the Second World War. He was promoted to Field Marshal in June 1942, after the fall of Tobruk, at age 50, becoming one of the youngest field marshals in German history. But the North African campaign ultimately ended in defeat, and Rommel returned to Europe where he commanded Army Group B in France, responsible for defending the Atlantic Wall against an anticipated Allied invasion. Then, on July 17, 1944, just weeks after the Allies landed at Normandy on June 6th, Rommel's staff car was strafed by British Spitfires near Livarot in Normandy. He suffered severe head injuries, a fractured skull, and was hospitalized for weeks. He was still recovering at his home in Herrlingen when the July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler shattered the political landscape of the Third Reich. The July 20th plot of 1944, in which a group of German officers and civilians attempted to kill Hitler with a bomb, placed under a conference table at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, failed when the briefcase containing the bomb was inadvertently moved moments before it exploded. Hitler survived with relatively minor injuries, and the revenge he extracted was furious and unrelenting. Thousands were arrested, interrogated, and executed. The Gestapo worked day and night to unravel every thread of the conspiracy, and those threads led eventually to the name of Erwin Rommel. The precise nature of Rommel's involvement in the plot against Hitler has been debated by historians ever since. What is clear is that several of the conspirators had been in contact. with Rommel or his immediate circle, and that Rommel had expressed in private conversations deep pessimism about Germany's ability to win the war and doubts about Hitler's leadership. Some of the plotters believed that Rommel, given his enormous popularity with the German public, would be essential to any post-Hitler government. Whether Rommel actively agreed to participate in the coup, or whether he simply knew of it and failed to report it, or whether he was only peripherally aware of what was being planned, remains a matter of historical dispute. But from Hitler's perspective, any association was enough. In the weeks that followed the failed coup, as the Gestapo's investigation deepened and captured conspirators named more names under torture, Rommel's fate was being decided quietly in Berlin. Hitler, who had genuinely admired Rommel and used him as a propaganda symbol, faced a dilemma: a public trial of Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the most beloved German military hero of the war, would be damaging. It would expose the extent of the conspiracy within the officer class, it would destroy a myth that had been carefully cultivated for years, and it would give the enemy a propaganda gift beyond price. The solution that Hitler and his inner circle arrived at was a private ultimatum. Rommel would be given the choice of taking his own life by poison, in which case his family would be protected and cared for, he would receive a state funeral, and his death would be announced to the German public as the result of his wounds from the July car accident. Or he could face the People's Court, the same kangaroo tribunal that had already condemned hundreds of conspirators to slow death by hanging from meat hooks. If he chose the trial, his family would not be protected. And so, on that morning of October 14, 1944, Generals Wilhelm Burgdorf and Ernst Meisel arrived at the villa in Herrlingen. Rommel, who had been recovering at home and who had recently been well enough to take short walks, met them in his study. The 15-year-old Manfred, home from his posting with the Air Force Auxiliary, was in the house. Lucy, Rommel's wife, was there too. The generals spoke privately with Rommel for perhaps half an hour. When they emerged, Rommel went upstairs, changed into his uniform and said goodbye to his family. He told them little, and what he did tell them was that he would be dead within 15 minutes. He told Manfred that he had been accused of having participated in the attempt on Hitler's life, that he had been given the choice between the poison and the trial, and that he had chosen the poison because of what a trial would mean for his family. He embraced Lucy. He spoke briefly with Manfred, and then he got into the general's waiting car. The vehicle drove a short distance down the road, stopped, and Rommel took the capsule. He was dead within minutes. He was 52 years old. The generals drove his body to a hospital in Ulm, where the official story was that he had died of his wounds. His family was left standing at the door of the villa in Herrlingen, carrying a secret that would define the rest of their lives. For Lucy Maria Rommel, born Lucy Maria Mollin on June 6, 1894, in Danzig, the days and weeks that followed her husband's death were a kind of suspended agony. She had married Erwin Rommel on November 27, 1916, during a brief leave from the front, and in nearly 3 decades of marriage she had built her life entirely around a man who was almost always away, always at war, always moving from one front to another. She was a devoted correspondent, writing to him constantly during his campaigns, and he wrote back with unusual frequency for a man of his generation and temperament, revealing in his letters a warmth and affection that surprised those who only knew him as the iron-willed commander. Their relationship was genuinely close and genuinely loving, and the loss of Rommel struck her at the deepest, personal level, but she could not grieve openly in the way that the circumstances truly warranted, because the official story was that her husband had died heroically of his wounds, and she was required to maintain that fiction in public. The state funeral arranged by Hitler for Rommel was an elaborate spectacle designed above all to preserve the myth. It took place on October 18, 1944, at the town hall in Ulm. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who had his own complicated feelings about the war and about the men who had conspired against Hitler, delivered the eulogy, praising Rommel as a man whose heart had been entirely given over to Germany. A wreath was sent by Hitler himself. Flags were flown at half-mast across the Reich. The German public, who knew Rommel as a figure of almost legendary stature, was told that the Desert Fox had succumbed at last to the injuries suffered when his staff car was attacked by Allied aircraft in Normandy. It was a carefully constructed lie, and Lucy was expected to stand within it and mourn in a way that was acceptable to the regime that had murdered her husband. She did so. She had little choice. The regime held all the cards. In the immediate aftermath of Rommel's death, the German government made good, at least initially, on the promises that had been made to secure his cooperation. Lucy was granted a widow's pension appropriate to the rank of Field Marshal. She was permitted to remain in the villa at Herrlingen for the time being. She was not subjected to the kind of brutal interrogation and arrest that fell upon the families of other conspirators in the July 20th plot. The Gestapo did question her, and the questioning was intrusive and frightening, but it did not escalate into the nightmare that so many other women connected to the conspiracy endured. Whether this was entirely because of the promises made on October 14th, or whether it was also because Lucy herself genuinely knew very little about the specific details of any plot against Hitler is not entirely clear. What is clear is that she survived the remaining months of the war in a state of terrible, isolated grief, unable to speak the truth about what had happened to anyone, unable to properly honour what her husband had been or what he had done. Manfred Rommel, 15 years old and serving with the Luftwaffenhelfer, the Air Force Auxiliary Service that was drafting Germany's teenage boys by late 1944 as the Reich's manpower reserves collapsed, returned to his unit after his father's death, but was released from service as the war approached its catastrophic conclusion. He would later describe the day of his father's death with the precision and emotional control of a man who had processed the memory 1,000 times over decades, but who could never entirely distance himself from it. He remembered the generals arriving. He remembered his father going upstairs to change. He remembered the goodbye, the brevity of it, and the enormous weight of what was left unsaid. He was a boy of 15, and the most famous soldier in Germany had just said goodbye to him in a hallway and gotten into a car and was dead within the hour. That was the inheritance Manfred Rommel carried into the rest of his life. The final months of the war brought additional upheaval for what remained of the Rommel family. As Allied forces advanced from both the west and the east, German civilians found themselves fleeing, hiding, or simply waiting for the inevitable end. Lucy, in Herrlingen near Ulm, found herself in the path of the Allied advance through southern Germany. The Americans reached this part of Baden-Württemberg in April 1945. Lucy was still in Herrlingen when they arrived. The villa that had been her home through Rommel's campaigns, that had received his letters from Africa and from France, that had been the site of his forced farewell, now received Allied soldiers. Lucy was questioned again, this time by American military intelligence, officers who were deeply interested in everything they could learn about the German military leadership. Unlike the Gestapo interrogations of the previous autumn, these conversations were at least conducted without the threat of imprisonment or execution hanging over her head. But they were exhausting and disorienting for a woman in her early 50s who had just lost her husband, was watching her country destroyed, and had been living under severe emotional strain for months. For Lucy, the practical question of survival in post-war Germany became pressing almost immediately. Germany in 1945 and 1946 was a devastated country, its cities in ruins, its economy destroyed, its food supply desperately strained, and its population suffering through what became known as the Stunde Null, or 0 hour, the moment of absolute collapse from which everything would have to be rebuilt. The pension arrangements that had been made by the Nazi government were in any case of questionable value, given that the government itself had ceased to exist. The new Allied occupation authorities, who were systematically dismantling the institutions of the Third Reich, were not necessarily inclined to honour the financial commitments that a dead dictatorship had made to the widow of a man whose precise role in the final political dramas of Nazism was not yet entirely understood. Lucy found herself in uncertain economic circumstances, navigating the bureaucratic complexities of post-war denazification and reconstruction while trying to maintain a household and support her son. The denazification process that the Allied occupation authorities imposed on German society in the years immediately after the war touched virtually everyone who had held any position of significance during the Nazi period. For members of Rommel's immediate family, the process was complicated by the ambiguity of Rommel's own position. He had been one of the Third Reich's most celebrated military commanders. He had served Hitler loyally for years. He had accepted his field marshal's baton and his estates and his acclaim. At the same time, he had been, by the end of his life, implicated in the conspiracy against Hitler and had died rather than face a regime that he apparently recognized as fundamentally criminal. Where exactly did that leave his family in the eyes of the denazification boards? The answer turned out to be relatively favourable. Lucy was not subjected to significant penalties through the denazification process, in part because of her husband's complicated final status, and in part because she herself had not held any position within the Nazi apparatus. She was classified in a category that allowed her to rebuild something like a normal life, though the definition of normal had been entirely shattered by everything that had happened. What did Lucy Rommel do with her life in the years that followed the war? She lived quietly in the southwestern corner of Germany that had always been her home and her husband's home, the old kingdom of Württemberg, that was now part of the new state of Baden-Württemberg in the emerging Federal Republic. She was not the kind of woman who sought public attention. She had spent her married life in the background, supporting a famous man from a distance, writing letters, maintaining a home, raising a son, largely on her own, during the years when her husband was in the field. That quiet domestic life was the one she returned to in peacetime, though now its centre was gone, and the nature of what she was maintaining had changed fundamentally. She was a widow, in her early 50s, in a country that was struggling to reconstitute itself from nothing. One of the things that occupied Lucy's attention in the years after the war was the question of her husband's papers and correspondence. Rommel had been a prolific writer of letters, and he had also kept notes and diaries relating to his campaigns. These documents represented an extraordinary archive of military history, but they were also deeply personal objects. The record of a marriage conducted largely through the postal service across thousands of miles and years of separation. What was to be done with them? Who had the right to interpret them and present them to the world? These questions became increasingly pressing as interest in the Second World War and its commanders began to generate a publishing industry in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Military historians, journalists, former soldiers, and popular writers were all competing to produce accounts of the campaigns and commanders of the recent conflict, and Erwin Rommel was one of the most sought-after subjects. His exotic North African campaigns, his reputation as a fair opponent who fought without the atrocities that characterized German warfare on the Eastern Front, and his dramatic death had made him a figure of fascination for both German and international audiences. Lucy eventually entered into an arrangement with Basil Henry Liddell Hart, the renowned British military theorist and historian, and with Rommel's former intelligence officer, Brigadier General Fritz Bayerlein, as well as other former German officers who had served with Rommel, to compile and edit a collection of Rommel's papers. The resulting book, published in 1953 under the title The Rommel Papers, became one of the most important primary source documents about the German military experience of the Second World War. Liddell Hart, who had long been an admirer of mobile warfare theory and who saw in Rommel a practitioner of the kind of operational thinking he had spent his career advocating, provided an extensive introduction and editorial framework. The book included Rommel's own writings about his campaigns in France and North Africa, along with extensive notes and commentary from those who had served with him. It was a publishing sensation, translated into multiple languages and read by military professionals and general readers alike. For Lucy, the book served multiple purposes. It preserved the record of her husband's military achievements in his own words. It contributed to the historical understanding of the campaigns in which he had participated, and it generated income that helped sustain her in the difficult economic circumstances of post-war Germany. The publication of the Rommel Papers also contributed significantly to the process by which Erwin Rommel's reputation was rehabilitated and elevated in the post-war period, both in Germany and internationally. In West Germany, where the new government and society were working through the immensely difficult process of confronting the Nazi past while simultaneously needing to rebuild a national identity and a national military, the figure of Rommel served particular purposes. He was a military professional of genius whose methods were technically brilliant and whose North African campaigns could be discussed without the taint of mass murder that attached to the Eastern Front and to the operations of the SS. He had died in opposition to Hitler, or at least that was how his death could be and was interpreted. He had been given a state funeral by the regime that killed him, a strange irony that made his story all the more compelling. He became, in the West German historical imagination, an example of the honourable German soldier who had done his duty without crossing the lines into criminality, a powerful myth that the new German state needed even as scholars would eventually begin to question how accurate that myth really was. And at the centre of this rehabilitation was Lucy. not through any political maneuvering or deliberate public relations campaign, but simply by virtue of being the widow who had preserved the papers, who had cooperated with the historians, and who had maintained a dignified public silence about the details of her loss. Lucy Rommel's later years unfolded in the quiet rhythms of a woman who had outlived both the world she had known and the man around whom that world had been organised. She moved at some point from the villa in Herrlingen, which carried too many memories and had become practically and emotionally complicated to maintain, and settled in the Baden-Württemberg town of Lörrach, in the far southwestern corner of Germany, near the Swiss border. It was a modest, private existence. She received visitors, she corresponded with historians and with former officers who had served with her husband. She kept her own counsel about the more painful aspects of what she had experienced, and she watched as the world built around her a legend that was both flattering to her husband's memory and somewhat at odds with the full complexity of what she had actually lived through. She did not give extensive public interviews, she did not write a memoir, she maintained a kind of widow's dignity that belonged to another era, a time when a woman's grief was considered a private matter and the appropriate response to public tragedy was silence rather than disclosure. The question of money and financial security was never entirely resolved for Lucy in a simple way. The economic circumstances of post-war West Germany improved dramatically through the 1950s and into the 1960s. The so-called Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, that transformed the Federal Republic from a devastated ruin into one of the most prosperous societies in Europe. As West Germany's general prosperity rose, so did the ability of the state to meet various obligations, including those to the widows and families of former military officers. Lucy eventually received pensions and financial arrangements that allowed her to live with dignity, if not with particular luxury. The royalties from the Rommel papers and from other publications relating to her husband's career also contributed to her financial situation. She was not wealthy in any extravagant sense, but she was not in poverty either, and the combination of the post-war economic recovery and the ongoing international interest in her husband's story provided a foundation of material security for her remaining years. One of the most delicate ongoing tasks that Lucy faced throughout the post-war years was managing the relationship between Rommel's memory and the changing political and historical landscape of West Germany. As the years passed and scholarship deepened, questions began to be raised about aspects of Rommel's career that the hagiographic literature of the late 1940s and 1950s had glossed over or ignored entirely. Had the Afrika Korps under Rommel's command committed any atrocities? Were there incidents involving prisoners of war or the treatment of Jewish civilians in North Africa that complicated the picture of the chivalrous desert fox? What exactly had Rommel known about the systematic murder of European Jews, and when had he known it? These questions would become more pressing in later decades, but even in the 1950s there were hints of the more complicated historical judgment that would eventually emerge. Lucy, as the guardian of her husband's papers and reputation, navigated these questions with the instincts of a woman who loved her husband deeply and who believed genuinely in his fundamental decency, even as she knew things about him and about the regime he had served that made simple answers impossible. She lived to see her son's extraordinary rise to prominence in West German public life, a story that represents one of the most remarkable second-generation narratives to emerge from the entire landscape of post-war Germany. She lived to see Germany rebuilt, divided, and beginning to grapple seriously with its past. She died on September 26, 1971, in Lörrach, at the age of 77. Her death received respectful notices in the West German press, which remembered her primarily as the widow of the Field Marshal, the woman who had preserved his papers, and the mother of a son who had built something genuinely honourable in the ruins his father's era had left behind. She was buried alongside her husband in the Rommel family grave in Herrlingen. It was a quiet ending to a life that had been marked by tremendous external drama and tremendous internal reserve, a life that had orbited around one of the 20th century's most compelling military figures and had survived the collapse of the world he served. But of all the members of Erwin Rommel's family, it was his son Manfred whose post-war life would most profoundly illustrate what it meant to carry a famous German military name into the second half of the 20th century and to do something genuinely constructive with it. Manfred Karl Johannes Rommel was born on December 24, 1928, in Stuttgart, the only child of Erwin and Lucy. He grew up as the son of a moderately successful military officer who had not yet achieved the fame that would come with the North African campaigns, and His early childhood was relatively ordinary by the standards of the time, though ordinary in Nazi Germany was already a concept loaded with dark implications. By the time Manfred was old enough to be truly aware of his surroundings, his father was already famous, already one of the most celebrated men in Germany, and the burden and privilege of that fame were part of the atmosphere the boy breathed from his earliest memories of adolescence. During the Second World War, Manfred's experience was shaped by the dual reality of being the son of Germany's most famous general, while also being a young German male in a country that was consuming its young men at a rate that made even teenagers into military assets. By 1943 and 1944, as Germany's military situation deteriorated on all fronts and manpower reserves grew desperate, boys as young as 14 and 15 were being drafted into auxiliary roles to free adult men for frontline duty. Manfred was assigned to the Luftwaffenhelfer, the Air Force Auxiliary, a service that put teenage boys in anti-aircraft battery crews and other support roles. He was serving in this capacity when his father died in October 1944. The experience of a 15-year-old boy watching his father get into a car and drive away to his own death is not something that can be adequately described in conventional language, and Manfred would spend much of his adult life finding ways, in public speeches and interviews, to articulate what that morning had meant and what it had done to him. When the war ended in May 1945, Manfred was 16 years old. He had spent his most formative years in a country at war, under a totalitarian regime, with a famous father who was mostly absent, who was one of the most celebrated figures in a corrupt state, and who had ultimately been murdered by that state in a way that Manfred could not yet speak of publicly. He emerged from the collapse of the Third Reich as a teenager, trying to understand what had happened to Germany and to his family and to himself, without the emotional or intellectual tools to process it all at once. The immediate post-war period in southern Germany was chaotic and difficult. Food was scarce. Infrastructure was damaged. The social and institutional frameworks of ordinary life had been shattered. American occupation forces controlled the region, and the process of rebuilding, denazification, and reconstituting civil life was only just beginning. For a 16-year-old boy with a famous name and no father, it was a disorienting and challenging time to be coming of age. What Manfred Rommel chose to do with the opportunities that peace and reconstruction gradually offered him speaks to both his personal character and the remarkable instincts he showed in navigating a situation that could very easily have led him in destructive directions. He chose to study. He enrolled at the University of Tübingen, one of the oldest and most distinguished universities in Germany, which had managed to maintain at least partial functioning even through the darkest years of the war, and which was quickly re-establishing itself as a serious academic institution in the early years of the Federal Republic. At Tübingen, Manfred studied law and political science. He was an attentive and capable student who engaged seriously with the intellectual and political questions of the emerging post-war order. He passed his bar examination and qualified as a lawyer, achieving this through his own effort and ability, rather than through any advantage that his famous name might have provided, since the name Rommel, while still carrying its historical resonance, did not come with automatic social privileges in the democratic and somewhat self-consciously egalitarian atmosphere of early West Germany. After qualifying as a lawyer, Manfred entered the service of the state of Baden-Württemberg as an administrative official. He joined the Christian Democratic Union, the CDU, which under Konrad Adenauer was the dominant party in West German politics, and which represented a broadly conservative but genuinely democratic vision for the new republic. In the CDU, Manfred found a political home that matched his own values, which combined a respect for traditional institutions and social order with a genuine commitment to democratic norms and to the kind of civic decency that he had apparently decided must be built out of the wreckage of his father's era. He was not a firebrand or a revolutionary. He was a methodical, serious, and fundamentally decent man who believed in the value of competent public administration and who worked his way through the hierarchies of municipal government with a quiet determination that eventually brought him to the highest elected position in Stuttgart. Stuttgart, the capital of Baden-Württemberg, is one of the most important cities in southwestern Germany, a major centre of industry, culture, and civic life, home to Mercedes-Benz and Porsche, and dozens of other significant German companies, as well as museums, universities, and a rich cultural tradition. It was in many ways the ideal city for Manfred Rommel to eventually lead because it was a city that embodied the central German narrative of the post-war period, the transformation from a ruined, morally compromised society into a prosperous, democratic, and internationally respected community. Manfred was elected Oberbürgermeister, or Lord Mayor, of Stuttgart in 1974. He was 45 years old when he took office, and he would remain in that position for 22 years, serving until 1996. It was one of the longest tenures in the history of the office, and during those 22 years he left a mark on Stuttgart and on German public life that went far beyond the routine accomplishments of municipal administration. From the earliest days of his time as mayor, Manfred Rommel made clear that his approach to public life would be shaped by a frank engagement with the moral and historical questions that his father's era had left unresolved. He did not hide from the name he carried, and he did not try to benefit from it in a shallow way. Instead, he engaged with the history of the Third Reich and with the question of German responsibility in a manner that was notably direct for a politician of his generation and background. He gave speeches about the Holocaust that were clear-eyed and morally serious. He supported memorial projects and educational initiatives that confronted the history of Nazi persecution. He worked to establish and maintain Stuttgart's connections with its Jewish community, which had been devastated during the Nazi period, but which was gradually being rebuilt in the post-war decades. He recognized that being the son of a famous German general carried with it not just personal significance, but a kind of representative function, that people looked at him partly to understand what Germany had become, and he tried to be worthy of that function. One of the most celebrated episodes of Manfred Rommel's public life, one that captured something essential about the man and about his understanding of what post-war Germany needed to do, involved not a German figure at all, but an American athlete. Jesse Owens was the black American sprinter who had won 4 gold medals at the 1936 Berlin Olympic Games, demolishing the racist ideology of Aryan supremacy in front of an audience that included Hitler himself. Owens's victories in Berlin had been one of the great sporting moments of the 20th century and one of the most potent symbolic defeats of Nazi racial theory. After the war, Owens returned to relative obscurity in the United States, where the racism he encountered in his own country made his Olympic glory bittersweet. But in Germany, and specifically in Stuttgart, he found something unexpected. Manfred Rommel, as a young official involved in Stuttgart's civic life in the early 1950s, was among those who helped arrange for Jesse Owens to be invited to Stuttgart for a track and field competition. The invitation was a deliberate gesture of reconciliation and acknowledgement, an expression of respect for a man who had humiliated Nazi racial ideology at its most public moment. Owens accepted, and the visit was by all accounts a genuinely warm and meaningful encounter. The two men, the son of the Desert Fox and the man who had run Hitler's ideology into the ground in front of the world, formed a friendship that lasted until Owens's death in 1980. It was the kind of human connection across the fault lines of history that Manfred Rommel seemed to seek out instinctively, as if he understood that the most important work of post-war reconciliation was done not through grand political gestures, but through genuine human relationships. His friendship with Jesse Owens was representative of a broader commitment to international reconciliation that characterized Manfred Rommel's years as mayor and as a public figure. Stuttgart developed strong twinning relationships with other cities during his tenure, connections that brought Stuttgart into genuine community with places that had been enemies or victims during the Nazi period. He was a voice for European integration and for the kind of outward-looking, internationally engaged German identity that the Federal Republic was trying to construct. He spoke and wrote about the responsibility of his generation, and specifically of his own family's position with a directness that was sometimes uncomfortable, but always fundamentally honest. He once said, in a formulation that was widely quoted, that his father had been a great general and that he himself had chosen a different kind of career, not as a rejection of his father, but as a recognition that the qualities that made for a great general were not the same as the qualities that made for a good political leader in a democracy, and that what Germany needed in the post-war era was people committed to the patient, unglamorous work of building democratic institutions rather than the brilliant, mercurial genius of military command. The question of how Manfred Rommel understood and presented his father is one of the most interesting threads in the post-war Rommel story. He was not a son who turned against his father or who made his career by denouncing the era his father had served. He had loved his father, and he maintained that love and that respect throughout his life. But he was also a man of genuine intellectual honesty, and as the historical scholarship on his father became more complicated and more demanding in its moral assessments, Manfred engaged with it thoughtfully rather than defensively. He acknowledged that his father had served a criminal regime. He acknowledged that the Wehrmacht, the German army in which his father had risen to its highest rank, had committed crimes and had been used as an instrument of conquest and occupation that caused tremendous suffering. He acknowledged that the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the idea that the professional German officer class had somehow remained apart from the atrocities of Nazism and had only ever been professional soldiers doing their duty, was a myth, not a historical reality. These were not easy things to say for a man who was simultaneously trying to honour his father's memory and to present himself as a credible voice in German public life. At the same time, Manfred Rommel maintained that his father had been, within the framework of his era and his profession, a fundamentally decent man who had made choices that, while not fully heroic in the sense of openly resisting evil, had at least moved in a moral direction in the final months of his life. He pointed to the absence of evidence that Rommel had participated in or ordered atrocities against civilian populations. He pointed to the fact that Rommel had apparently, in private, expressed views deeply critical of Hitler and of the direction the war was taking. He pointed above all to the October 14th choice to the decision to take poison rather than submit to a show trial, and he interpreted that choice as an act of moral courage, however constrained the circumstances in which it was made. This interpretation was not without its critics. Some historians argued that Rommel had served the regime for too long and too effectively to be rehabilitated simply because he had died in opposition to it. But Manfred's position was nuanced enough and honestly enough stated to command respect even from those who disagreed with his final assessment of his father. Now, while Manfred Rommel's story is the central narrative of the Rommel family's post-war history, it is not the only one. There was another member of Rommel's immediate family whose existence was somewhat more complicated and whose story has received considerably less attention, both because it involves a less public life and because it touches on aspects of Erwin Rommel's personal history that do not fit neatly into the heroic narrative. Before his marriage to Lucy in November 1916, Erwin Rommel had been involved with a young woman named Walburga Stemmer. Walburga was not an aristocrat or a woman of particular social position. She was a working-class woman from Weingarten in Württemberg, and her relationship with the young Erwin Rommel resulted in the birth of a daughter on December 8, 1913, more than 2 years before Rommel married Lucy. The child was named Gertrude. Rommel acknowledged the child as his daughter, but he did not marry Walburga. He married Lucy instead, presumably with Lucy's knowledge of Gertrude's existence, since Rommel maintained contact with his daughter. Walburga Stemmer died in 1928 when Gertrude was only 15 years old. After Walburga's death, arrangements were made for Gertrude's upbringing and care, and she eventually took the surname of the family she lived with or married into. She became known as Gertrude Pan. She lived a quiet, private life entirely outside the circles of military celebrity and post-war historical debate that surrounded her famous half-brother, Manfred, and her stepmother, Lucy. Unlike Manfred, she did not become a public figure. She did not make statements about her father or give interviews to historians. She lived in the way that ordinary people live, obscured from the historical record precisely because she did not seek attention and because the attention that naturally gravitated toward the Rommel name was drawn far more powerfully toward Manfred. Her father had acknowledged her, had presumably felt some responsibility toward her, but she had not been the child who grew up in his household, who witnessed his farewell, who carried the Rommel name into public life. She was a peripheral figure in the drama of a famous family, which did not mean her life was less significant as a life, but it did mean that it is very difficult to reconstruct its details from the historical record. What happened to Gertrude Pan after the war is not extensively documented in the publicly available historical literature. She survived the war as an ordinary German civilian, subject to the same deprivations and disruptions that affected all German civilians in the final years and the immediate aftermath of the conflict. She was old enough to have a formed adult life before the war ended, having been born in 1913. She would have been in her early 30s when the war concluded in 1945. Whatever her life held, it was lived outside the glare of historical attention. Her father's fame did not open doors for her in the way it might have in a different era, because the kind of fame Rommel had in the Third Reich was precisely the kind that post-war German society was most ambivalent about. She was not listed among the principal family members in the public accounts of Rommel's life and death that dominated the post-war literature, which focused primarily on Lucy and Manfred. She passed through history quietly, which is perhaps not the worst fate for a person, and is certainly a fate that the majority of people who lived through the 20th century would recognize as their own. Returning to the broader picture of the Rommel family's post-war experience, it is worth considering the other members of Erwin Rommel's extended family who were affected by his death and by the complex legacy of his fame. Erwin Rommel Sr., his father, had died in 1913 before the First World War even began, so he was not alive to see his sons rise or fall. Helena von Lutz, Rommel's mother, lived until 1940, dying before her son achieved his greatest fame and certainly before his death. Of Rommel's three siblings, his brother Karl and his sisters Helene and Gertrude all lived through the Second World War and into the post-war period. They were not public figures, and their post-war lives are not extensively documented, but they shared the complicated experience of bearing a family, a name that carried enormous weight and that meant different things to different people in the shifting moral and political climate of the Federal Republic. Like millions of other ordinary Germans, they navigated denazification, economic reconstruction, and the gradual reckoning with the Nazi past in the ways available to private citizens, quietly and mostly without historical record. The village of Herrlingen itself, the place where Rommel had spent his final months and where he had said goodbye to his family on the morning of October 14, 1944, became in some ways a site of local historical memory in the post-war years. The villa where the Rommel family had lived was eventually converted to other uses, becoming at various points a school and an educational institution. The fact that a place associated with one of Germany's most famous soldiers had been repurposed into an educational facility carried a certain symbolic resonance, intentional or not. Herrlingen is a small community, and the presence of the Rommel connection gave it a kind of historical significance that small villages in Germany often carry, bound up in the larger history of a country that fought 2 world wars in the first half of the 20th century, and that spent the second half trying to understand how those wars had been possible and what responsibilities they imposed on subsequent generations. The relationship between Erwin Rommel and his family during the war years is itself a story that reveals much about the man and about the particular emotional texture of what his wife and son were left carrying after his death. Rommel was, by the standards of most military commanders at any level of seniority, an unusually attentive and emotionally expressive correspondent. He wrote to Lucy constantly during his campaigns in France, in the desert, and in Normandy, sending letters and postcards that described the landscapes he was passing through, the progress of the fighting in terms that the military censors would permit, his physical condition, his moods, and his feelings for her and for Manfred. These letters, many of which were eventually published as part of the Rommel Papers and in other compilations, reveal a man who was capable of genuine tenderness and who maintained a rich emotional life even in the midst of the intense operational pressures of commanding a major force in active combat. He wrote to Lucy about sunsets in the desert. He wrote about food, about his health, about his longing to be home. He wrote about Manfred's progress at school, asking for updates and taking a father's interest in his son's development, even from thousands of miles away. These letters were not the letters of a man performing emotions for public consumption or for posterity. They were private communications between a husband and a wife, and the warmth and directness of their tone suggests that the Rommel household, whatever its complicated external circumstances, was built on a foundation of genuine feeling. For Lucy, the experience of being Rommel's wife during the North African campaigns was one of sustained anxiety, punctuated by the extraordinary drama of her husband's public triumphs and public reversals. She followed the news from North Africa with the intensity of someone whose entire emotional life was bound up in the outcome. When the Afrika Korps achieved its spectacular advances, capturing Tobruk in June 1942 and driving to within a few dozen miles of Alexandria, she shared in the reflected glory that the German propaganda machine generously supplied. Rommel was everywhere in the German press and on the radio, the Desert Fox, the brilliant commander who was winning spectacular victories in a far-off land, and Lucy was his wife, which meant that she was in some sense a public figure, even though she was not a public person in any active sense of that term. She did not give interviews or appear at public functions. She was not the kind of political wife who serves as a visible partner in a husband's public persona. She was a private woman who happened to be married to one of the most famous men in Germany, and she navigated that position with the same quiet dignity she maintained throughout the rest of her life. The failure of the North African campaign, which was sealed by the surrender of the entire German and Italian force in Tunisia in May 1943, was a public humiliation that attached itself, unfairly but inevitably, to the name of the commander who had been so publicly celebrated during the victories. By the time of the Tunisian surrender, Rommel himself was already back in Europe, having been recalled from North Africa in March 1943 before the final catastrophe, ostensibly on medical grounds, but effectively because he had already reached the conclusion that the position was untenable. The defeat in North Africa marked the beginning of the end of Rommel's relationship with Hitler, a relationship that had always been asymmetric in the way that all relationships between powerful patrons and dependent clients are asymmetric, and that had begun to show strain as the military situation deteriorated and as Rommel began to voice, in his increasingly frank and increasingly ignored memoranda to Berlin, his assessment that the war could not be won and that political solutions needed to be sought before military solutions became entirely impossible. What did Lucy know about her husband's growing pessimism and his increasingly dangerous closeness to opposition circles? The honest answer is that we do not know exactly. The letters that survive from this period show a man who was increasingly unwell, exhausted and disillusioned, but who was careful about what he committed to paper in communications that might be intercepted or inspected by the Nazi security apparatus. He was a professional soldier who understood operational security, and he applied it to his personal correspondence, as well as his military communications, when circumstances required it. Lucy was loyal and discreet, qualities that she maintained throughout their marriage and throughout her widowhood. She did not speak publicly about what she had known or suspected about her husband's political evolution in the final years of his life, and the reticence with which she treated this topic left considerable space for speculation and historical reconstruction that produced varying conclusions. What is clear is that by the time Rommel was assigned to command Army Group B in France in early 1944, preparing for the Allied invasion that everyone knew was coming, he was in some fundamental way a changed man from the eager, energetic, tactically creative commander who had swept across the desert with the Afrika Korps. He was in poor health, worn down by years of active campaigning in extreme conditions, and he was increasingly convinced that Germany faced military defeat. His preparations for the Atlantic Wall defense in France were meticulous and serious, and he brought his characteristic energy and attention to detail to the task of strengthening the coastal defenses. But his private correspondence and the reports of those around him suggest that he no longer believed these defenses could ultimately prevent the outcome that he could see coming. He argued to his superiors that the best chance to defeat an Allied landing was to destroy it on the beaches, that the armoured reserves must be positioned close to the coast rather than held back, and that the window of opportunity would be brief. When his views on this tactical question were overruled, it contributed to his growing sense that the command structure of the German military had become dysfunctional, and that Hitler's interference in operational matters had made effective defence impossible. The family in Herrlingen saw Rommel occasionally during this period, during leaves when he could get away from his headquarters in France. Manfred was then 15 years old and spending increasing time in the Luftwaffenhelfer, the Air Force auxiliary units that were drafting German teenagers as the country's manpower crisis deepened. Father and son spent what time they could together during these periods, and the quality of those visits, the sense that something was changing and that the future was uncertain, seems to have left deep impressions on both of them. Rommel did not explain to Manfred the full extent of his political concerns or his contacts with opposition circles. A 15-year-old boy, even the son of a field marshal, could not be expected to carry such secrets safely. But the emotional atmosphere of those final visits must have communicated something, the way that adults' unspoken anxieties always communicate themselves to perceptive young people, even when the words are carefully withheld. And then came the events of July 1944 in rapid and terrible succession. On July 6, 1944, just weeks after the Allied landings in Normandy, Rommel visited Hitler at Berchtesgaden and made what was apparently a frank statement of his assessment that the military situation in the West was desperate and deteriorating, and that Germany needed to find a political way out of the war. Hitler's response, as it always was when his commanders told him unpleasant truths, was to insist that the war would be won and to make clear that such defeatist assessments were unwelcome. Less than 2 weeks later, on July 17th, Rommel's staff car was attacked by British aircraft near Livarot in Normandy, and he suffered the head injuries that would keep him hospitalised and then convalescing for weeks. 3 days after that, on July 20th, the bomb planted in Hitler's conference room at the Wolf's Lair failed to kill its intended target, and the long list of consequences began to unfold. Rommel, still hospitalised with his skull fracture, was identified by the Gestapo as a man connected to the conspiracy, and the machinery of his destruction was set in motion even, as he lay recovering in a French hospital and then in Herrlingen. The specific details of Rommel's final weeks at home in Herrlingen, between his return from the hospital in August 1944 and the arrival of Generals Burgdorf and Meisel on October 14th, are reconstructed primarily from Manfred's later accounts, from the recollections of others who were present in Herrlingen during that period, and from the few documents that survived the chaotic final months of the war. Rommel knew that he was under investigation. He knew that former colleagues and subordinates were being arrested, interrogated, and in some cases executed. He knew that the conspiracy had been identified and that the Gestapo was working through the evidence and the confessions of captured conspirators with methodical cruelty. He received visitors at Herrlingen, including at least one visit from a general who apparently came to assess his state of mind and perhaps to offer or receive information about how the situation was developing. He went for short walks as his health permitted, and those who saw him in this period reported a man who was outwardly composed, but who was clearly carrying a tremendous internal burden. Lucy shared this burden, though perhaps not fully. She knew her husband was in danger, she knew that the political situation was catastrophic, and that the Gestapo was in the business of finding connections to the failed conspiracy. She knew that her husband's name had been mentioned in contexts that made the authorities suspicious. Whether she knew the specific details of what he had said to whom and what promises, if any, he had made to the conspirators is unclear. She did know on the morning of October 14th, when the two generals arrived, that something terrible was happening. Rommel's brief explanation to her and to Manfred that he had been accused of participation in the assassination attempt and that he had been given a choice between the capsule and the trial was the most direct. Communication he could manage in the few minutes they had before he had to go. He told them he had chosen the capsule to protect them. And then he was gone. The official notification that came to the family in the hours and days following Rommel's death was a lie, of course. The announcement that he had died of his wounds from the July car accident was the cover story that Berlin had prepared, and Lucy was expected to receive it as if it were the truth. In some ways, the need to perform grief at the death of a hero, while privately knowing the far more terrible truth of what had actually happened, was one of the most psychologically brutal aspects of the entire situation. She could not mourn, honestly. She could not tell anyone the real story. She could not even acknowledge to herself, in any public way, the full nature of what had happened and what it meant. She had to accept the state funeral, the official condolences, the military honours, the wreath from Hitler, and carry all of it, as if it were the proper tribute to a proper death, rather than the elaborate farce of a regime murdering its own most famous general and then celebrating him in death to avoid the embarrassment of acknowledging what it had done. The specific question of when exactly the German public, and eventually the world, learned the truth about Rommel's death is an interesting one. The cover story was maintained through the end of the war, and in the chaos of the German collapse in the spring of 1945, there were many more immediately pressing matters than the circumstances of deaths that had occurred the previous autumn. But as the Allied victory opened up German archives and as survivors began to speak, the truth about October 14, 1944, emerged relatively quickly. By the time Lucy was being questioned by Allied intelligence officers in the summer and autumn of 1945, the broad outlines of what had really happened were already known to the investigators, and Lucy was no longer required to maintain the official fiction with people who were in a position to hear the truth. The story of the forced suicide became part of the historical record, and it became one of the key elements of the Rommel legend that the post-war German public constructed around their most famous military commander. Among the curious features of the Rommel family's post-war situation was their relationship with the families of other figures from the Third Reich. The landscape of post-war West Germany was populated with the widows, children, and relatives of men who had occupied various positions in the Nazi hierarchy, from the most obviously criminal figures tried at Nuremberg to the more ambiguous members of the military and civilian establishment who had served the regime without being specifically prosecuted for it. These families often knew each other, lived in the same social circles, and faced versions of the same challenges in navigating the new political and social landscape of the Federal Republic. The wives of Wehrmacht generals who had died or been imprisoned formed a kind of informal community, connected by shared experience and mutual understanding in ways that the wider German society could not fully appreciate. Lucy Rommel was part of this community, though always in the somewhat special position of a woman whose husband's status was complicated by his implicated death and by the extraordinary public attention that the Rommel name attracted. The relationship between the Rommel family and the families of the July 20th conspirators is a particularly interesting thread in this social history. The families of the men who had actually placed the bomb and organized the conspiracy, people like Klaus von Stauffenberg, whose wife Nina survived the war and lived until 2006, or the families of other key conspirators like Wilhelm Canaris, Karl Friedrich Goerdeler, and Ludwig Beck, faced a somewhat different post-war trajectory than the Rommel family. The conspirators were initially treated with ambivalence in West Germany, because honouring men who had tried to murder Hitler was complicated in a society that was simultaneously trying to rebuild itself and to distance itself from Nazism. Over time, however, the July 20th conspirators were increasingly honoured in West Germany as the founders of a German tradition of resistance, and the families of the executed men received official recognition and various forms of support. Lucy and Manfred Rommel occupied an interesting position relative to this commemoration, because Rommel's death was connected to July 20th, but his precise role remained ambiguous, and the family was never quite fully incorporated into the July 20th memorial tradition, even as they were clearly affected by it. The annual commemorations of the July 20th assassination attempt, which became increasingly elaborate and emotionally significant in West German public life as the decades passed, sometimes involved Manfred Rommel in various capacities. He was not among the core group of families most directly connected to the conspiracy, but his family's connection to the events was acknowledged, and he occasionally participated in related events and discussions. His presence at these commemorations served the broader purpose of acknowledging that the landscape of German resistance to Nazism was complicated, and that it included not only those who actively plotted and died in explicit opposition, but also those who moved toward resistance from the inside of the military establishment and who paid with their lives for even that ambiguous position. The physical legacy of the Rommel connection to various places in Baden-Württemberg extended beyond Herrlingen. Rommel's birthplace of Heidenheim an der Brenz, a small industrial town in the Swabian Alb, about 50 kilometers from Stuttgart, maintained its connection to its most famous son through the Erwin Rommel Museum, which was established to provide a permanent location for the display of documents, photographs and artifacts related to Rommel's life and career. The museum occupied a position in the local cultural landscape that was both an attraction for the military history tourism that Rommel's name reliably generated, and a venue for more serious historical engagement with questions about how to present a figure of this complexity to contemporary audiences. The challenge facing any institution dedicated to Rommel's memory was to provide genuine historical information about his career and about the context in which it was conducted, without either producing uncritical hagiography that ignored the moral complications of his service to the Third Reich, or producing polemical denunciation that ignored the genuine complexity of his position and the real qualities he possessed as a soldier and as a man. The museums and memorials associated with Rommel's name attracted visitors from a remarkably wide range of backgrounds. British veterans of the North African campaign or their children and grandchildren made pilgrimage to Herrlingen and Heidenheim out of a complex mixture of historical curiosity and the kind of respect for a formidable adversary that military culture tends to cultivate. American military professionals studied Rommel's campaigns at their service academies and occasionally came to Germany to visit the places associated with his life. Israeli scholars, who had every reason to view the Third Reich's military leadership with the deepest skepticism, nonetheless engaged with Rommel's story with the analytical seriousness that characterized their approach to the history of their own nation's most terrible experiences. The breadth of international interest in Rommel's story was itself a testimony to the extent to which he had transcended the merely national context of his career and become a figure of universal military historical significance. Manfred Rommel's engagement with this international interest was consistent with the broader approach he brought to everything connected to his father's legacy. He was willing to meet with British veterans and their families. He was willing to speak with American scholars. He was willing to engage with Israeli historians who had serious and challenging questions about the relationship between the Afrika Korps and the Jewish communities in North Africa. He did not hide behind his father's celebrity or use it as a shield against difficult questions. He answered the questions honestly, acknowledged the uncertainties in their historical record, and maintained throughout the kind of personal dignity that prevented the discussions from becoming either celebrations of his father's genius or exercises in collective guilt-mongering. It was a difficult balance to maintain, and he maintained it with remarkable consistency over the decades of his public life. The question of how Rommel's North African campaigns related to the broader question of German war crimes in the Second World War was one that became increasingly important as historical scholarship deepened and as the original generation of participants aged and died. The traditional narrative, largely established in the 1950s and 1960s, held that the Desert War had been conducted with a degree of mutual respect and professional chivalry that set it apart from the barbarism of the Eastern Front. Rommel had not shot prisoners in cold blood. He had not participated in the systematic murder of civilian populations. He had treated his opponents with a certain professional respect that they returned. Churchill's famous praise, delivered in the House of Commons in January 1942, had set the tone for this interpretation. Rommel was a great general, even if he was an enemy, and the war he fought was a war conducted within the limits of professional military conduct. This narrative was deeply comforting to all parties involved, to West Germans who needed to believe that their military tradition had not been entirely corrupted by Nazism, to British veterans who preferred to think of their adversary as a worthy professional rather than a war criminal, and to the international public that consumed the increasingly popular literature and film productions about the North African campaign. The complications in this narrative emerged gradually. Historians examining specific incidents found evidence of killings of prisoners that contradicted the chivalric picture. Research into German activities in Libya and Tunisia found evidence that the Afrika Korps had, on at least some occasions, cooperated with or failed to prevent actions against Jewish populations in the territories under German control. The commando order, issued by Hitler in October 1942 and requiring the summary execution of Allied commandos captured in operations behind German lines, was carried out by units operating under German command in the North African theatre, though the extent of Rommel's personal knowledge of and responsibility for specific executions in this context remains a matter of historical debate. None of these findings produced a picture remotely comparable to the systematic atrocities of the Eastern Front, but they did suggest that the Desert War had not been as clean as the legend maintained, and that Rommel had not been as entirely separate from the criminal dimensions of the Wehrmacht's conduct as the post-war narrative had implied. For the Rommel family, and specifically for Manfred, engaging with these findings was a genuinely difficult but genuinely necessary exercise. He did not dismiss them. He did not claim that they were fabrications or that the scholars who produced them were motivated by ideological agendas. He acknowledged that a fuller and more honest historical picture of his father's career required engagement with the difficult as well as the laudatory aspects of the evidence, and he expressed this acknowledgement publicly when asked. At the same time, he maintained that the specific evidence against his father personally, as opposed to against the institutions he commanded and the system he served, remained limited, and that the character of his father as a man who had moved toward opposition at the end of his life and who had consistently shown personal qualities of physical courage and concern for his soldiers was not erased by the systemic crimes of the regime he served. These were not unreasonable positions to take given the evidence available, and they were positions maintained with honesty rather than with the kind of desperate defensiveness that characterizes the families of men against whom the historical evidence is far more damning. One of the more poignant dimensions of Manfred Rommel's long engagement with his father's legacy was the simple personal fact that he had never really known his father in the way that most sons know their fathers. Erwin Rommel was almost always away during Manfred's childhood, campaigning in Poland, in France, in North Africa, in Italy, in France again. The visits home were brief and infrequent. The relationship was sustained primarily by letters, by photographs, by the stories that came with military celebrity, and by the intermittent physical presence of a man whose attention when he was home was fully engaged and genuinely loving. but who was physically there for only a tiny fraction of the years of Manfred's childhood and early adolescence. Manfred knew his father through his public reputation as well as through personal experience, and the two sources of knowledge did not always tell the same story. The father he had known personally was a warm and engaged man who wrote wonderful letters and who took real interest in his son's development. The father the world knew was the desert fox, the tactical genius, the military hero, the man Hitler had killed. Reconciling these two versions of the same person was a task that Manfred returned to repeatedly throughout his life, in speeches and interviews, and in his own memoir. He once described his father's letters as the most immediate and authentic source of his knowledge of the man, more revealing than the military histories or the official biographies or the documentary films. In those letters, he said, he could hear his father's voice, the specific cadences and preoccupations of a specific human being, rather than the generalized heroics of a public legend. He treasured the letters not as historical documents, though they were that, but as the closest thing he had to his father's actual presence in the world. This was the private reality behind the public story of the Rommel family's post-war life, a son keeping company with his dead father through the written record of thoughts and feelings that had crossed continents and oceans and decades, and finding in those letters a father he could love without equivocation or qualification, a man rather than a legend. The post-war lives of the Rommel family also intersected in various ways with the extraordinary economic transformation of West Germany in the 1950s and 1960s. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that transformed the Federal Republic from a ruined country into an economic powerhouse, was one of the most remarkable achievements of post-war European reconstruction, and its effects on ordinary German life were profound and rapid. Stuttgart, where Manfred would eventually serve as mayor, was one of the great centres of this economic revival. Its automobile industry expanding at an astonishing rate, its unemployment falling, its infrastructure being rebuilt, its population growing, and its quality of life improving dramatically through these years. The city that Manfred Rommel came to lead in 1974 was already a prosperous and dynamic place, and his task was to manage and direct that prosperity in ways that served all of the city's inhabitants, not just those who had most obviously benefited from the economic boom. The social changes that accompanied the economic miracle were no less profound than the economic ones. West Germany was becoming a more open, more internationally connected, and more self-critical society than it had been in the years immediately following the war, when the primary preoccupation had been physical survival and economic reconstruction. By the 1960s, a new generation of Germans who had been born after or during the war and who had no personal memory of the Nazi period were beginning to ask sharp questions about what their parents and grandparents had done and known and tolerated during the Third Reich. This generational challenge, which exploded into the student movements of 1968 and their aftermath, produced a profound shift in West German historical consciousness and a much more demanding engagement with the question of German responsibility for the crimes of the Nazi era. Manfred Rommel belonged to the generation immediately preceding the 1968 generation, old enough to have childhood memories of the war period, but young enough to have built his adult identity entirely in the post-war democratic framework. His position between these generations gave him a particular perspective on both the older world from which he came and the newer world that the 1968 generation was demanding. His response to the student movements and the historical debates they stimulated was characteristically thoughtful. He was not a reactionary who dismissed the young people's challenge to their parents' and grandparents' moral record as impertinent or destructive. He understood that the challenge was necessary, that West Germany could not build a fully healthy democratic culture on a foundation of collective amnesia about what had happened under Nazism, and that the discomfort the 1968 generation's questioning produced in their elders was a productive discomfort, however painful. At the same time, he was not an uncritical admirer of all aspects of the student movement, which combined genuine moral seriousness about the Nazi past with political positions and cultural attitudes that were not always as clearly beneficial as the historical reckoning they demanded. He navigated these tensions, as he navigated most things, with a pragmatic common sense that acknowledged complexity without being paralyzed by it. Throughout all of this, the central fact of his father's death and his father's legacy remained the organizing principle of Manfred Rommel's public identity, a frame through which others inevitably viewed him and which he had to engage with whenever he entered public discourse. He could not escape it, and he did not try to escape it. He made his peace with being the son of the desert fox in the only way that was ultimately possible, which was to be himself, to build something real and substantial on his own account, and to engage with his inheritance honestly and without either denying it or being consumed by it. He was Manfred Rommel, the mayor, the lawyer, the Democrat, the friend of Jesse Owens, the man who had said goodbye to his father in a hallway at 15 and spent the next 68 years figuring out what to do with that. That is not a small life. It is, in many ways, an exemplary one. The final legacy of the Rommel family after World War II is perhaps best understood, not as a story about a military legend or about the moral complexities of Nazi-era service, but as a story about what human beings do with the circumstances they inherit. None of the members of Rommel's family chose their starting conditions. Lucy did not choose to be the widow of Germany's most famous general, murdered by the regime he had served, unable for months to speak the truth about what had happened. Manfred did not choose to be the 15-year-old son who watched his father drive away to his death and was left to make sense of it for the next 7 decades. Gertrude Pan did not choose to be the unacknowledged daughter of a famous man, living outside the historical record while her father's name filled books and museums and documentaries. These were the circumstances they were given. What they did with them is the measure of who they were. Beyond the immediate Rommel family, it is worth pausing to consider the broader landscape of German military families in the post-war period, because the Rommel family's experience gains additional meaning when seen against this backdrop. The families of Rommel's fellow field marshals faced a remarkable variety of post-war fates, and the contrast between their experiences and those of the Rommel family illuminates what was distinctive about the Rommel story. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, widely considered by military professionals to be the most technically gifted of the German commanders of the Second World War, survived the war and was tried by a British military tribunal in 1949. Convicted of war crimes related to the treatment of civilians on the Eastern Front, and sentenced to 18 years imprisonment. He was released in 1953 for health reasons after serving less than 4 years. He went on to write his famous memoir, Lost Victories, and to advise the West German government on the structure of the new Bundeswehr. His family experienced the upheaval of his imprisonment and trial, but ultimately benefited from his release and his rehabilitation as a respected strategic thinker in the post-war military establishment. The Manstein case illustrates how even men convicted of serious war crimes could find their way back to respectability in West Germany's rapidly evolving post-war environment. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the German High Command and one of Hitler's most consistently compliant military advisors, was tried at the main Nuremberg trials and hanged on October 16, 1946. His family was left to deal with the stigma of his conviction and execution for war crimes and crimes against humanity, a far more complete rupture with the past than the Rommel family had to manage. Field Marshal Alfred Jodl, Keitel's close colleague and Hitler's chief of operations, was also tried at Nuremberg and hanged on the same day as Keitel. His family similarly had to rebuild in the shadow of the gallows. Jodl was posthumously acquitted by a West German denazification court in 1953, a decision that caused considerable controversy, but the reversal came too late to change the fundamental circumstances of his family's post-war situation. Field Marshal Ernst Busch died in British captivity in 1945 before he could be tried. Field Marshal Robert Ritter von Greim committed suicide with a cyanide capsule in an American prisoner of war camp in May 1945, just days after being named as the last commander of the Luftwaffe by Hitler in the final week of the Third Reich. The variety of these fates, execution, imprisonment, death in captivity, suicide, and in Rommel's case, forced suicide before any trial could occur, reflects the enormous diversity of circumstances that attended the collapse of the Third Reich and the fate of those who had led its armed forces. Against this backdrop, the Rommel family's post-war experience can be seen as relatively fortunate in material terms, even while remaining genuinely tragic in human terms. Lucy received her widow's pension. Manfred was able to pursue his education and his career without the kind of active persecution that befell the families of men convicted at Nuremberg or associated directly with the most obvious atrocities of the regime. The family's most famous member died before the end of the war, which meant that he was not subject to post-war trial proceedings and that his death could be incorporated into the narrative of German resistance to Hitler rather than German service to Hitler. This positioning was not entirely deserved in historical terms, but it was the positioning that emerged from the specific circumstances of October 14, 1944, and it conferred on the Rommel family a particular status in the post-war landscape of German memory that other military families did not enjoy. The role of the media, both German and international, in constructing and perpetuating the Rommel legend is another dimension of the post-war story that touched the family in ongoing ways. From the earliest days after the war, Rommel was a compelling subject for journalists, filmmakers, and popular historians. The British, with their particular tradition of gentlemanly conduct and fair play, found in Rommel a German officer they could admire without moral discomfort, an adversary whose military brilliance they had experienced directly and whose personal conduct in the field they found, by and large, respectable. This British admiration produced a stream of books, articles, and eventually films that contributed enormously to the international Rommel legend, and that circulated back into Germany to reinforce the domestic version of the myth. The 1951 film The Desert Fox, produced by 20th Century Fox and starring James Mason as Rommel, was one of the most significant early contributions to this international myth-making. The film presented Rommel as a fundamentally honourable man who had eventually turned against Hitler and died for it, a straightforward narrative that was emotionally powerful and historically simplified, but that captured something real about the public's need to find moral complexity and even heroism within the landscape of the German military. Lucy and Manfred were aware of these media representations and had varying degrees of influence over them. Lucy cooperated with some of the British productions and historians who sought access to the Rommel papers and to her personal memories, and this cooperation shaped the kinds of accounts that emerged. Manfred, over the decades of his public life, became increasingly sophisticated at managing his engagement with the media's interest in his father, declining some requests that he considered sensationalistic or historically irresponsible and engaging with others that he believed were approaching the subject seriously. He understood that the Rommel story was public property in a way that most family stories are not, that it belonged to history as well as to personal memory, and that his role was not to control the narrative, but to ensure that the most responsible and honest versions of it had access to the most relevant evidence. This was a mature and historically literate position, and it was one that he maintained consistently throughout his decades in the public eye. One of the most striking aspects of Manfred Rommel's legacy is the consistency with which he was praised by people across the political spectrum and across the historical divides of his era. Germans who had been victims of the Nazi regime, or whose families had suffered under it, found in him a German public figure who acknowledged their suffering honestly and without reservation. Germans who had served in the Wehrmacht and who were still navigating their own complicated feelings about that service, found in him a man who could honour military tradition without whitewashing military complicity. Young Germans who had grown up entirely in the Democratic Federal Republic and who knew Nazism only as history found in him a bridge between the world their grandparents had lived in and the world they themselves inhabited. This breadth of appeal was not the result of political calculation or deliberate image management. It was the natural consequence of a man being consistently honest, consistently decent, and consistently committed to the values he had chosen to build his life around, the values of democracy, tolerance, and honest engagement with the past. The story of Erwin Rommel's family after World War II, then, is ultimately not a simple story of redemption or tragedy or triumph or failure. It is a complex human story about how people carry their inheritance, how they honour what deserves, to be honoured while acknowledging what must be acknowledged, and how the private experience of loss and grief coexists with the public demands of historical significance. Lucy Rommel lost her husband to a state that had used and then murdered him, and she spent the rest of her life preserving his memory with the loyalty and the dignity that the man himself had earned from her across nearly 3 decades of marriage. Manfred Rommel lost his father at 15 in the most terrible circumstances and spent the next 68 years building something genuinely worthy with the name and the legacy he had inherited, never losing sight of either the love he carried for his father or the complexity of the world that father had served. And in doing so, he became not just a son of a famous general, but a public figure of genuine significance in his own right. A man who demonstrated through the choices of his own life that the German tradition could produce not only the military genius and the loyal servant of evil that his father had embodied, but also the democratic citizen, the honest public servant, and the bridge builder across the deepest divides of the 20th century's most catastrophic half-century. The broader story of how West Germany as a society dealt with the legacy of its military commanders from the Second World War is essential context for understanding the Rommel family's experience. In the late 1940s and 1950s, as the Federal Republic was establishing itself and as the Cold War created a new strategic environment in which West Germany's rearmament became a Western priority, there was a powerful political and cultural incentive to rehabilitate the professional military tradition. The German army was being reconstituted as the Bundeswehr, and the new military needed a tradition, a set of role models, and a professional ethos that could be traced to the old Wehrmacht, without carrying the full moral weight of everything the Wehrmacht had done. Rommel fitted perfectly into this need. He was brilliant, he was famous, he had died in apparent opposition to Hitler, and his North African campaigns offered a theatre of war that could be discussed in purely military professional terms without immediately raising questions about mass murder of civilians or the Holocaust. The Rommel myth was therefore not just a family affair but a national project, and Lucy and Manfred were, whether they intended it or not, key participants in that project. The decision by West Germany's government and military establishment to embrace Rommel as a kind of patron saint of the new democratic military had practical consequences that touched the Rommel family directly. Bundeswehr barracks were named after Rommel. His portrait appeared in military installations. His campaigns were studied at the officer academies of the new German army. This process of official rehabilitation meant that the Rommel name, rather than becoming an embarrassment or a source of stigma in the way that the names of more obviously criminal commanders did, became instead a kind of honoured credential. Manfred Rommel was able to enter public life carrying his father's name and find it to be an asset, a complicated and morally ambiguous asset requiring careful handling, but an asset nonetheless rather than a burden. This was not the experience of the children and families of commanders who had been tried at Nuremberg or who were associated with the Holocaust in direct and undeniable ways. The Rommel family occupied a special position in the landscape of post-war German military memory, a position defined by ambiguity and by the particular way that Erwin Rommel had died. For Manfred Rommel, the official military rehabilitation of his father's memory was something he supported in general terms, while also maintaining the intellectual honesty to acknowledge the complications. He was not the kind of son who simply basked in reflected glory. He was the kind of son who recognized that the glory itself needed to be examined, questioned, and honestly assessed before it could be properly honored. Over the decades of his mayoralty in Stuttgart and in his subsequent public life after leaving office, he gave numerous interviews and delivered numerous speeches in which he wrestled publicly with the question of his father's legacy. He was not always comfortable in this role. He had been trained as a lawyer, not as a philosopher or a historian, and the questions that scholars and journalists put to him about his father's knowledge of Nazi crimes, his father's relationship to the July 20th conspiracy, and his father's ultimate moral status were questions that required both historical precision and emotional courage to answer honestly. One of the central historical controversies about Erwin Rommel that Manfred had to navigate in his public life was the debate about Rommel's relationship to the July 20th assassination plot. In the immediate post-war years, the story that gained traction was a fairly straightforward narrative in which Rommel had been approached by the conspirators, had expressed sympathy for the goal of ending the war, but objections to the method of assassination, and had paid for this association with his life. This narrative cast Rommel as a kind of passive martyr, someone who had been pulled into the orbit of the conspiracy without fully committing to it, and who had died because Hitler could not tolerate even this degree of proximity to his enemies. Over time, however, more research and more documentary evidence complicated this picture. Some historians argued that Rommel had been more actively engaged with the conspirators than the passive martyr story suggested, while others argued that the evidence of his actual commitment to any plan remained thin and that his death had more to do with the Gestapo's broad sweep of anyone connected to the conspiracy than with any specific plan of action on Rommel's part. Manfred navigated these debates with a consistency that was notable. He acknowledged the uncertainty. He did not claim more for his father than the evidence supported, but he maintained that whatever the precise level of involvement, the fact of his father's death and the manner in which it was extracted from him represented a moral reality that deserved recognition. Another dimension of the historical debate about Erwin Rommel that gathered force in later decades concerned the question of war crimes and the Afrika Korps. The traditional narrative of the North African campaign had emphasized the so-called chivalric nature of the Desert War, the mutual respect between opposing commanders, the relatively limited suffering of civilian populations in the Libyan and Egyptian desert compared to the catastrophic civilian casualty rates in the Soviet Union and elsewhere. This narrative was largely accurate as far as it went, but it obscured some important aspects of the full picture. Researchers, examining the North African campaign in greater detail, found evidence of incidents in which the Afrika Korps had mistreated prisoners of war, had shot captured commandos in accordance with Hitler's commando order, and had in some cases cooperated with or failed to prevent the activities of units involved in the persecution of Jewish populations in the North African territories under German control. None of these findings produced evidence that Rommel himself had personally ordered or carried out atrocities of the scale and nature that characterized German warfare in Eastern Europe, but they did complicate the picture of the spotlessly honorable desert war that the popular mythology had presented. For Manfred, these debates required him to acknowledge that the full truth about his father was more complex than the heroic legend, while also maintaining that the complexity did not erase the genuine qualities of military skill, personal courage, and, ultimately, moral choice that had characterized his father's career. The most prominent scholarly attempt to challenge the Rommel legend came from several directions in the 1990s and 2000s, as German historical culture underwent a broader reckoning with the Second World War and its crimes that went considerably further than the relatively comfortable self-examination of the early post-war decades. The exhibition known as the Crimes of the Wehrmacht, which toured German and Austrian cities between 1995 and 1999, caused enormous controversy by presenting documentary evidence that the regular German army, not just the SS and other specifically ideological units, had committed widespread crimes against civilian populations and prisoners of war on the Eastern Front and elsewhere. The exhibition did not focus specifically on Rommel or the Afrika Korps, but it contributed to a general climate in which the myth of the clean Wehrmacht became much harder to sustain, and in which the professional German officer class of the EE Second World War was subjected to a more critical moral scrutiny than it had previously received in mainstream German culture. Manfred Rommel, as the most visible living member of the family of one of that officer class's most celebrated members, found himself engaged in an ongoing public conversation about what his father had represented and what his father's legacy meant in the context of this more demanding historical self-examination. He handled these challenges, by most accounts, with notable dignity and intellectual courage. He was willing to say things in public that other sons of famous German commanders might have been less willing to say. He acknowledged Germany's guilt. He acknowledged the Holocaust without equivocation. He acknowledged that the military culture in which his father had operated had been complicit in crimes, even where his father's personal complicity remained unclear. And he did all of this while maintaining a love for his father that was personal and genuine, not strategic. He once said that he didn't know whether his father would have been happy with the kind of public figure he, Manfred, had become, and that he had sometimes wondered what it would have meant to grow up with a living father who could have guided him, and what kind of man that father would have been in peacetime outside the extraordinary circumstances that had defined the years they shared. It was a profoundly human reflection from a man who had lost his father at 15, in circumstances that most people cannot imagine, and who had then spent the next 6 decades in the unique position of being the son of a historical legend, rather than simply the son of a man. As mayor of Stuttgart, Manfred Rommel's practical achievements were substantial and lasting. During his 22 years in office, he oversaw significant periods of Stuttgart's urban development and modernization. He managed the city's relationship with its major industrial employers, including the great automobile manufacturers that gave the region much of its economic identity. He navigated the political challenges of a city that, like all German cities of its size and industrial significance, faced questions about urban renewal, immigration, social services, and civic identity that were shaped by the specific history of West Germany's rapid post-war transformation. He was known as an administrator who was both competent and genuinely engaged, who listened to the people he served and who brought to public life the combination of legal training, political pragmatism, and moral seriousness that characterized his approach to everything. He was not a charismatic figure in the conventional political sense of someone who generated excitement and personal devotion. He was a different kind of public servant, one whose authority derived from competence and consistency rather than from personal magnetism. Stuttgart has a significant Jewish community that was reconstituting itself in the post-war decades, and Manfred Rommel's relationship with that community is one of the most telling indicators of his character. He worked actively to support the community's rebuilding and to acknowledge the city's responsibility for what had happened to its Jewish citizens during the Nazi period. He participated in ceremonies of remembrance. He supported the establishment of memorials. He maintained relationships with Jewish community leaders that were characterized by mutual respect and genuine engagement, rather than the performative gestures of political correctness. The community, for its part, responded to his engagement with appreciation, recognizing in him a German public figure who was not hiding from history but honestly confronting it. This relationship across one of the deepest moral divides in German history was perhaps Manfred Rommel's most significant personal achievement, and it was achieved not through any political calculation but through what appears to have been an entirely genuine commitment to what reconciliation actually required. Stuttgart also has a substantial Turkish immigrant community, which grew significantly during the 1960s and 1970s as West Germany recruited guest workers from Turkey to fuel its economic expansion. The integration of these communities into German society was one of the most contentious and difficult political questions of the post-war decades, and Manfred Rommel was among the German politicians of his generation who took a relatively inclusive and humane position on the question of immigration and integration. He recognized that the people who had come to Germany to work and who had built their lives there deserved to be treated with dignity and to be included in the civic life of the communities where they had settled. This was not an uncontroversial position in the political climate of West Germany in the 1980s and 1990s, but it was consistent with the broader moral framework that Manfred Rommel brought to everything he did in public life. When Manfred Rommel retired from the mayorship of Stuttgart in 1996 after 22 years in office, he left behind a city that had changed enormously from the one he had inherited in 1974, and a legacy that was widely recognized as one of the most distinguished in the city's recent history. He did not retreat into complete private life after leaving office. He remained an active public figure, writing, speaking, and engaging with the ongoing debates about German history and identity that continued to generate controversy and insight in the reunified Germany of the 1990s and 2000s. The reunification of Germany in 1990, the merging of the Federal Republic of West Germany with the former German Democratic Republic, was itself an event that generated enormous questions about national identity, about what kind of country Germany wanted to be, and about how the two very different post-war histories of East and West Germany could be reconciled into a coherent national narrative. Manfred Rommel's perspective on these questions was shaped by his distinctive position, the son of a man who had embodied a certain kind of German identity that the post-war era had both rehabilitated and questioned, and a politician who had spent his career trying to build something genuinely democratic and humane from the ruins of his father's era. The reunification also raised fresh questions about the treatment of the German military tradition in the new Germany. The Bundeswehr, which had been the West German army since the mid-1950s, now became the army of the unified Germany, and it inherited the traditions, the barracks names, and the institutional culture that had been built up over the preceding decades. Several Bundeswehr facilities had been named after Erwin Rommel during the post-war period, reflecting his status as a recognized patron of the new democratic military. As historical scrutiny of the Wehrmacht intensified in the 1990s, the question of whether military facilities should continue to bear the names of commanders who had served a criminal regime became increasingly contentious. Some barracks named after various German commanders were eventually renamed as the Bundeswehr, underwent its own historical reckoning. The Rommel-named installations generated their own debates, with some arguing that Rommel's opposition to Hitler and his manner of death made him an appropriate name for a democratic military, and others arguing that the full complexity of his service to the Third Reich made his continued veneration problematic. These debates were ongoing and unresolved in various forums, and they were debates in which Manfred Rommel, as the living embodiment of the Rommel legacy, inevitably found himself engaged. The Rommel family's connection to the town of Herrlingen and to the broader landscape of Baden-Württemberg remained significant throughout the post-war decades. Herrlingen, as mentioned, became a site of local historical memory, with the villa where Rommel had lived and died eventually serving as a school. The small cemetery in Herrlingen where Erwin Rommel was buried, and where Lucy was later interred beside him, became a place of pilgrimage for military history enthusiasts, a steady stream of visitors who came to pay their respects at the grave of the Desert Fox, from countries that included Britain and the United States, as well as Germany and the rest of Europe. The grave was maintained respectfully, and it attracted both genuine historical interest and the more uncomfortable attentions of individuals who venerated Rommel in ways that had less to do with historical appreciation than with nostalgia for things that should not be nostalgic about. The Rommel family and the authorities in Herrlingen had to navigate this dimension of the family's legacy. The fact that the name Rommel attracted not only legitimate historical interest but also less savoury forms of reverence. A Rommel museum was eventually established in Herrlingen, and there is also a museum in Rommel's birthplace of Heidenheim an der Brenz. These institutions serve the important function of presenting Rommel's life and career in historical context, providing information about his campaigns, his character, his relationship with the Nazi regime, and his death within frameworks that are designed to be educational and historically responsible, rather than simply celebratory. The existence of these museums reflects the extent to which the Rommel name has become institutionalized as part of the regional and national historical landscape of Baden-Württemberg and Germany more broadly. They also reflect the ongoing challenge of presenting a figure like Rommel to contemporary audiences, people who may come with very different preconceptions and who need to be helped to understand the full complexity of a man who was simultaneously a military genius, a servant of a criminal state, and, arguably, a late and incomplete resistor of that state. The publication of David Irving's controversial biography of Rommel in 1977 represented a significant moment in the Rommel literature, though for reasons that were not entirely comfortable for the family. Irving, who would later become notorious for his Holocaust denial and for his attempts to rehabilitate Hitler, produced a biography that was extensively researched at the primary source level, but that was already showing the tendencies towards selective interpretation and agenda-driven historical writing that would eventually lead to his complete discrediting as a scholar. His Rommel biography presented a figure who was heroic in conventional military terms, but who was also, in Irving's reading, deeply implicated in the political world of Nazism in ways that complicated the straightforward resistance narrative. Manfred Rommel and other members of the family distanced themselves from Irving in subsequent years as Irving's views on the Holocaust became more extreme and more public. The association between the Rommel family and Irving's work was an uncomfortable one that Manfred was careful to clarify whenever the occasion arose. His father's story did not need David Irving's advocacy, and the family did not want any part of the ideological agenda that Irving was eventually revealed to be pursuing under the cover of historical research. More responsible scholarship on Rommel continued to appear through the 1990s and 2000s. Ralph Georg Ruth published an important German-language biography. Dennis Showalter contributed a significant English-language study. Birgit Beck and other historians examined the question of the Wehrmacht's crimes with specific reference to North Africa and the Afrika Korps. These works collectively produced a more nuanced and more honest picture of Rommel than either the hagiographic literature of the 1950s or the more polemical revisionism of later decades had managed. They acknowledged his genuine military genius while also acknowledging the moral compromises of his service to the regime, the specific incidents that complicated the chivalric Desert War narrative, and the genuine uncertainty about his precise role in the July 20th conspiracy. Manfred Rommel engaged with this literature thoughtfully, recommending serious scholarship to journalists who asked him about his father and consistently maintaining that he preferred honest historical engagement to comfortable mythology, even when the honest engagement produced conclusions that were uncomfortable for him personally. Throughout his later years, Manfred Rommel reflected publicly and in interviews on what it had meant to be his father's son. He spoke about the father he had known, a man who was mostly absent but who, when present, was warm and engaged and genuinely loving toward his family. He spoke about the boy he had been when his father died, 15 years old, barely understanding what was happening, knowing only that something terrible was taking place and that his life had changed in ways he could not yet articulate. He spoke about the choices he had made in building his own career, choosing law and public administration and democratic politics rather than the military, and he spoke about these choices not as rejections of his father, but as responses to a different moment in German history, a moment that called for different virtues than those his father had displayed. He had enormous admiration for his father's military gifts, for the physical courage and the tactical brilliance and the quality of leadership that had made Rommel one of the acknowledged masters of armoured warfare. But he also had the wisdom to recognise that these gifts, however spectacular in their own sphere, did not constitute a complete moral vision, and that the era into which he had been born required something more than military genius. The question of what Manfred Rommel's political career meant for the broader German project of coming to terms with the past is one that historians and political scientists have occasionally addressed, if not as fully as the topic might deserve. He represented something genuinely unusual in post-war German politics, a man whose family had been at the centre of the Nazi military establishment and who had chosen to build his post-war career entirely on the democratic foundations of the Federal Republic, rather than seeking any restoration of the old order or any softening of the judgments that history had delivered on the regime his father had served. This was not an inevitable choice. The post-war landscape of West Germany was populated with former Nazis and former fellow travellers who had found their way back into positions of influence by various routes, some through the formal denazification process that allowed rehabilitation on relatively easy terms, others by simply keeping quiet and waiting for the social amnesia that always follows catastrophe. Manfred Rommel's choice to engage publicly, to acknowledge the crimes of the era, and to use his platform and his famous name in the service of democratic and humanitarian values, rather than in the service of any reactionary nostalgia, was a genuine moral choice, and it deserves to be recognised as such. Stuttgart itself became, in a sense, a kind of monument to what Manfred Rommel had tried to build in his years as mayor. It is today one of the most economically successful and culturally vibrant cities in Germany, a centre of innovation and industry that has successfully integrated the diverse communities that have made their home there over the post-war decades. Its Jewish community has been rebuilt, its Turkish community has become an integral part of the city's life, and it maintains connections with partner cities around the world that reflect the kind of outward-looking, internationally engaged German civic identity that Manfred spent his career trying to foster. None of this can be attributed solely to his 22 years as mayor, of course. Cities are built by their inhabitants across generations, and Stuttgart's success reflects the combined efforts of hundreds of thousands of people over many decades. But the tone that a mayor sets, the values that a city's leadership articulates and embodies, matter in ways that accumulate over time. And the tone that Manfred Rommel set in Stuttgart during his 2 decades in office contributed to the kind of city it became. After leaving the mayorship in 1996, Manfred Rommel remained active in public life for some years, speaking, writing, and engaging with the ongoing public conversations about German history and identity. He remained a sought-after figure for interviews and documentary projects about his father, and he continued to handle these requests with the combination of personal honesty and intellectual seriousness that had characterized his public life from the beginning. He wrote a memoir that provided his personal account of his life and of his relationship with his father's legacy. He participated in commemorations of significant wartime anniversaries. He maintained the connections he had built over decades with individuals and communities in Germany and abroad. He was a man who had grown into an elder statesman's role without quite having the conventional profile of a national political figure, having spent his career at the municipal rather than the federal level, but whose moral authority and historical significance gave him a standing that transcended the usual categories of German public life. The health challenges of old age eventually caught up with Manfred Rommel in the years following his retirement from the mayoralty. He had lived an active and energetic life and had maintained his public engagement for years after leaving office, but the physical demands of aging gradually reduced his ability to participate as actively as he had done throughout his career. He developed health problems in his later years that increasingly limited his public activities. But even in his final years, when he was less able to travel and speak publicly, he remained a figure of significance in the historical memory of Stuttgart and of Germany. A man whose name and whose career represented something genuine and valuable in the long and difficult story of Germany's post-war transformation. Manfred Rommel died on November 7, 2013 in Stuttgart. He was 84 years old. His death was widely reported in Germany and internationally, with obituaries that acknowledged both his 22 years as mayor of Stuttgart and his unique position as the son of the Desert Fox, a man who had taken one of the most famous names in German military history and made something genuinely worthy of it. Tributes came from across the German political spectrum, from fellow members of the CDU, from representatives of Stuttgart's diverse communities, from scholars and historians who had engaged with him over the decades of the Rommel historical debates, and from individuals who simply recognized in him a public figure of unusual character and integrity. Angela Merkel, then serving as German Chancellor, was among those who paid tribute, calling him a person who had served his city with devotion and who had represented the best values of democratic Germany. The tributes from Stuttgart's Jewish community were particularly moving. Community representatives recalled Manfred Rommel's consistent engagement with the community, his attendance at memorial events, his support for Jewish institutions in the city, and the personal relationships he had maintained across what might have seemed an impossible historical divide. His friendship with Jesse Owens was cited as an example of the human capacity for reconciliation that Manfred Rommel seemed to embody, the idea that the son of a man who had served a regime of racial terror could become a genuine friend of one of that regime's most celebrated victims, and that this friendship was not a political performance, but a genuine human connection. These tributes captured something essential about what Manfred Rommel had meant as a public figure, which was not primarily his administrative achievements as mayor, though those were real and substantial, but the moral quality of his engagement with the world into which he had been born and the choices he had made about who to be within it. The reaction to his death also brought renewed attention to the broader question of what the Rommel family's post-war experience meant as a historical case study. Here was a family that had been at the centre of one of the most dramatic moments in the history of the Third Reich, a family whose patriarch had died in the most extraordinary circumstances, who had then navigated the complex terrain of post-war Germany with varying degrees of visibility and success, and who had, in the person of Manfred at least, produced a genuinely admirable public figure whose life testified to the possibility of building something good from the most difficult of beginnings. Not all families in this situation had done the same. Some had retreated into denial. Some had maintained a defiant loyalty to the old order. Some had simply disappeared into the anonymity that Germany's social upheaval made available to those who wanted to avoid scrutiny. The Rommel family, through Manfred's choices and through Lucy's dignified preservation of her husband's papers, had done something different. But it would be wrong to sentimentalize the Rommel family's post-war experience or to use it as a simple redemption narrative that ties up the difficult questions of the Third Reich's aftermath in a comfortable bow. The truth is more complicated. Erwin Rommel served Adolf Hitler loyally for most of the war. He accepted the Field Marshal's baton and the honours of a regime built on racism and murder. The North African campaigns he led, whatever their military brilliance and whatever the relative restraint of their conduct compared to other theatres, were campaigns conducted in the service of a war of conquest that was fundamentally criminal in its aims. The death he died, while dramatic and in some ways honourable, was a consequence not primarily of principled resistance but of the political calculations of a regime that wanted to preserve a useful myth. His family carried the benefits of his celebrity, the widow's pension, the public respect, the historical attention, the architectural honours in the form of barracks named after him, and they also carried the costs, the moral complexity, the historical debates, and the private grief of people who had loved a man the world insisted on discussing as a historical figure rather than a human being. Manfred Rommel understood all of this and spent his life trying to hold all of it together honestly, which is perhaps the most that any son could do with such a legacy. He did not pretend that his father had been a saint. He didn't pretend that the regime his father had served was anything other than what it was. But he also did not pretend that his love for his father was a moral error, or that the personal qualities that had made Rommel a great commander, the physical courage, the tactical imagination, the loyalty to his men, were cancelled out by the context in which those qualities had operated. He held the complexity without resolving it falsely, and in doing so, he demonstrated a kind of moral intelligence that is rare in anyone, and especially rare in someone who had as much personal stake in the resolution as he did. After Manfred's death in 2013, the continuation of the Rommel family story passed to the next generation. Manfred had married and had children, and the Rommel family name continued into the 21st century through his descendants. His son, Daniel Rommel, did not pursue the kind of public political career that his father had, which meant that the intense, historical scrutiny that had accompanied Manfred throughout his life was not replicated for the next generation in the same way. The family's public role as representatives of a historical legacy requiring constant management and explanation effectively ended with Manfred's death, which was perhaps appropriate. 3 generations after Erwin Rommel's death, the family name still carried historical resonance, but the living obligation to engage with that resonance in the public sphere had been met, with remarkable completeness, by Manfred, and there was no reason to expect or require that the obligation be inherited indefinitely by subsequent generations. The Rommel grave in Herrlingen remains a visited site. The museums in Herrlingen and Heidenheim continue to receive visitors from around the world who come to learn about the desert fox. The academic debates about Rommel's precise historical significance, his moral status, and his place in the larger story of the German military in the Second World War continue to generate scholarship and controversy. The barracks debates continue in various forms. The question of how to name military facilities after historical figures and what criteria should apply to soldiers who served criminal regimes without personally committing crimes of the most obvious kind is a question that many democratic societies with complicated military histories are still working out, and the Rommel case remains one of the most prominent examples in the German context. What is not debated, because it is a matter of clear historical record, is the fact that the family of Erwin Rommel navigated the post-war world with a degree of honesty, dignity, and moral seriousness that stands out in the broader landscape of post-war German families trying to come to terms with their Nazi-era inheritances. Lucy Rommel preserved her husband's papers and cooperated with serious historical inquiry, even when the inquiry produced uncomfortable conclusions. Manfred Rommel built a distinguished democratic political career, maintained genuine relationships across historical divides, engaged honestly with the most difficult questions about his father's legacy, and used his public platform to advocate for the values of tolerance and democratic inclusion rather than for any form of rehabilitation of the era his father had served. These were real achievements, and they deserve to be recognized as such, not because they erase or compensate for the crimes of the regime that Erwin Rommel served, but because they represent what post-war Germany at its best managed to build from its worst history. The story of the Rommel family after World War II is ultimately a story about what it means to inherit a complicated legacy and to try to do something worthy with it. It is a story about grief and survival, about the practical difficulties of post-war reconstruction, about the complexities of historical memory and national mythology, and about the choices that individuals make when they find themselves in positions that seem to demand either dishonesty or courage. Lucy Rommel chose a dignified silence that preserved the historical record. Manfred Rommel chose a public engagement that demonstrated what the next generation of Germany could be. Gertrude Pan chose a private life that asked nothing of history and offered nothing to it. Each of these choices was made within constraints that none of them had chosen, the constraints of a family name, a famous death, and a collapsed world that had to be rebuilt from the rubble. And through it all, the question that hangs over the entire story is the question that hangs over all of post-war German history. What do you do when you love someone who served a system that was evil? Manfred Rommel spent 84 years finding an answer that, while not complete, was at least honest. He loved his father. He mourned the father who had said goodbye on a cold October morning and gotten into a car and never come back. He honoured that loss and that love by building something genuinely good in the world his father had left behind. He did not pretend the past was different from what it was. He did not pretend his love was wrong. He held both things at once, and he went to work. That, in the end, may be the most that any of us can do with the complicated inheritances we receive from those who came before us. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative. If you enjoyed learning about what happened to Erwin Rommel's family after World War II, make sure to check out our video about what happened to the children of Nazi leaders, which covers more remarkable stories of the second generation coming to terms with extraordinary circumstances. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one.